Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 17th session of the SAM Best Practice webinar. My name is Nicolas Rousseau. I'm Product Manager for ITAM, Flexera Manager, and this will be my pleasure today to spend an hour with you, like every month, on a specific topic. So we'll start with news, and today we will focus and deep dive into a topic which is around how to manage allocations and exemptions for optimal license consumption. So this is a quite precise topic, but you will see that actually it's quite wide, and there are a wide number of use cases where we could use these allocation and exemptions, and we have enhanced things over the time. So hopefully at the end of this session that will be recorded, you will get the details and the help if you need to yourself go through some allocation processes, meaning allocating servers to licenses or users to licenses for your day-to-day SAM activities. So let's start with the agenda. I just hope the sound is okay. I've moved to the next slide. So hopefully you see an agenda slide now. It sounds like there could be multiple tabs in your internet browser, so have a look. The agenda today will be around the last session's pointers. Every month we have a session. So in January there was a session, and I will answer the questions that were asked during the session and give you the pointers to the recording. And just like the last session was recorded and is uploaded in the community, you will get this session, both slides and recording, posted, I would say, within a week in the community, in the community hub. And then as a second part, we will go through some news. So first, the recent release. So we have a 2.1 that just got released, but also a 2.2, which is coming for cloud customers. And very shortly, very briefly, I will discuss about the updates in the SAM Best Practice Hub. And finally, we will go through the topic of the day, which is how to manage allocations and exemptions for optimal license consumption. We will start with the business context. We will then understand and discuss a little bit what are the license priorities. We will discuss about the allocation design, go through some use cases, such as Adobe subscriptions from Active Directory, Windows Server optimization, and end user licenses like Adobe. That will then go through a list of tips and tricks, and will open to the coming intelligent license allocation and exemptions feature, which is following the previous one that got released back in December this year, which is the intelligent license restriction. Let's move on. I think this time, sometimes I'm a little bit over time. I think this time will be smooth, and I will finish on time in exactly 1 hour. So, talking about the last session was going a little bit over time. I finished something like 1 hour 15 after I started the session. It was around making a Windows Server and a core infrastructure server optimal license position in 1 hour. So that was a quite ambitious goal. I would say I started the demo at 15 past. So indeed, it took me 1 hour. And you can find the recording and the PowerPoint in this, following this link, which is the community that you know well. In the community, we have this community hub section and events and webinar, and you get here the recording, the detailed agenda, the recording, and the presentation that was used, that you can access at any time, and that will be kept for a long time. Okay, so this is about the last session pointer. There were a number of questions, so I think I will have time to go through each of the questions. There were not so many. So first thing, first question was, would it be possible to adjust the optimized number of VMs in a VM host to determine whether we should use CIS standard or data center? And so what I explained during the demo last time is that this is all about cost. So the SAM optimization Windows Server optimization report is using the cost, which is a price per write, price per core. And if you go back to the presentation or to the recording, you will see that this price is taken from the default reference licenses, as we call them, which are basically the licenses maintained with the largest number of purchase and that cover Windows Server Data Center, for instance, or Windows Server Data Center and more products, which is typically what CIS Data Center is. So you will see in the documentation, in the report documentation, once you run the report, we explain how to, what licenses are captured. And depending on the price that you have on the licenses, reference licenses, that could be either the overridden price, that's something you can set on the purchase tab, or the price calculated from the latest purchase. There will be, the prices will be reported back to the report. Otherwise, there will be default cost that we use. And what is important is the threshold between the CIS data center, for instance, and CIS standard edition licenses. What is the ratio of the cost, which will determine the threshold that typically is 10 virtual machines for a host. It will become more interesting to use data center edition. So really, this is all about the cost and the price and making sure that either you use the default or you set the price on your licenses that will be used by the report as default reference licenses. Second question, that was about a way to report and reflect the time element of a cost. And that's an interesting question. So I will not go through the full question. That was quite long. But typically, there are some perpetual costs, there are some maintenance costs, and if we want to have a more, a chargeback view on licensing, it's interesting to not trust only the last cost of the software type, which is typically what we use to compute the cost per write, but it will be interesting to take and mix the perpetual cost, if it's not a subscription, for instance, and the, let's say, maintenance cost. And here, I have a small formula which you could apply, but typically, a yearly cost, just like we do for total cost of ownership, a yearly cost is probably what makes the most sense. And it will be typically, the license cost, perpetual license cost, divided by 4. So amortizing the cost of the licenses for 4 years, plus a yearly maintenance, which is typically a maintenance yearly cost. And in the end, you get sort of a yearly cost for your license, if you want to do some chargeback. And the idea is that you can put this cost as another written price on the license, just so that it reflects the yearly cost if you wanted to do some chargeback, for instance. Okay, next one. Will the report for CIS be canned, or will it be documented for us to build? So I have a question which is an answer which is a little bit long here. Actually, it's an answer. So I guess the customer was an on-premise customer because he doesn't have yet the reports. So the Windows Server reports are present in 2022 R1 and 2022 R2, the flat version, and on-premise, and have extensive documentation. The PowerPoint description that I delivered describes in detail the 3 approaches. And finally, there is a knowledge base article, if you're on-premise, that contains now so I'm opening it just to show you. Okay, so I'm opening this one. And you will see that in this community post, we have the description for 2 reports, the SQL Server report and the Windows Server report. And you have the documentation that got released and updated last week, so fresh from the press. The version 6 is here, And in this document, you get, again, the description of the report, but also the code for creating the reports. And I've refreshed the SQL code of the Windows Server optimization report so that you can get so that you can get the full and latest version of the report that includes, the new per VM licensing that you have with Windows Server since October 2022. So that's it. And there is, for on-prem customers again, an example of allocation script that I just updated as well last week, which allows to automatically simulate the report result and allocate every morning. Eventually, if you put that as a step of your import, your custom inventory import, you could every morning reallocate the optimal servers along with their optimal license consumption to the licenses that you have defined with this document. So I encourage you to have a look to this knowledge base article. You will see that it probably answers your question and your need. Okay, so we'll just check, if there are questions or maybe issues. Okay, so no question. Everything is all right. Let's move on and move to the next part, which is about the news. So we just released last week, and actually tomorrow, I think, for US. We're just releasing 2022 R2.1, which is the new cloud version that comes after the December 2022 R2 version, which was both on-prem and cloud. And we have, I would say, tactical changes, but that can be useful. And particularly, this one will be useful for today's session. So that's what we call the allocation reason that allows to document why you allocated a device or a user to a license. So it's a very simple text field. I will show you that you can set up in various ways, but it makes it faster and easier to trace back what happened and what did what when, because 6 months later, you may wonder why somebody allocated a server to a license. You will be able to document that. We also enhance the VM inventory gaps from vCenter report. This report is very useful for cloud customers, particularly because they had no on-prem version, and this report returns all the virtual machines that you have inventoried, eventually with the agent, or that have been returned or reported by the vCenters that you have collected, the vCenter data, and you will see VM per VM, if the VM is inventoried, yes or no, and we have added the last known state of the virtual machine. Is it started? Is it stopped? The VM type and the device name. So small announcements, but again, you will see next quarter, or actually in 2 months, we will have what we call the SAM Operations Hub. That's a hub that will show you all the gaps, analyze the performance of your SAM activity. And this hub will actually give you pointers to a number of KPIs. And this is a very important one, how many VM does vCenter report that you don't collect with your inventory? This is a very important gap that you need to understand. The report is in your 2022 R2 or 2022 R2.1 instance with additional comments. And the last announcement we have with this 2022 R2.1 is that we can recognize GBoss. So this is a Red Hat middleware. GBoss with a number of applications. There is a link in the docs of Flexera.com, and you will see that the new agent, so you need to update the agent for this to get this additional information, is able to query specific data using, I'm not sure if it's using PowerShell or specific APIs, but then you get information that you were not getting as file evidences or insert evidence. Let's move on. Item 2022 R2.2 is coming for 1st of March. So the next one. It will include the trends for the SAM optimization hub. I will show you a screenshot from this SAM best practice hub. So it will include not only the snapshots, how much are you saving today, how much could you be saving if you are taking action, but it will show the evolution of the costs and the savings. And it brings more reports on the SAM operations hub. again, reports about gaps or issues. You will see we will have 2 more reports, or maybe 3, that will allow to understand some potential issues with how the application recognition gaps, for instance. It will catch all the unrecognized installer evidence and will show if these evidences are for vendors that you manage with licenses. I will deep dive a little bit probably next month, but you will get more of these reports which show your level of recognition. Can you trust your inventory data? Or for instance, that will identify potential issues with the imports with merged devices. Other things we have extended, actually I forgot for this 2020 Tour 2.2, we're extending also the how is it called? We're extending the container screen to add more information. So in the all container screen, you will see the cost center of the host. You will see the location of the host of the container. You will see the corporate unit. You will see a number of cores, number of processors. So we're extending the data that you can get from this all containers screen. That's one more item in this list. And finally, we're also extending with putting some additional columns, a lot of small tactical things, but that complete, hopefully, the value you get from ITAM. The e-server column, which was added in the reporting. So now you can create a report that shows a device and that has this e-server flag set to yes or no automatically, depending on the operating system. This e-server column will be part of the inventory screens, all inventory and active inventory. And finally, a topic again that resonates with today, the cluster will be in the apply allocations and exemptions file. Okay, so these are smaller or bigger things coming soon. And the SAM Best Practice Hub gives you a step back on all these topics and gives many pointers to existing solutions. I'll just open very quickly because today we will not be too constrained by time. So if I open the link, today the big day because we go above 7,000 views on this document. So you will see in this document many things. It talks a lot about the hubs, the Operations Transparency Hub, the SAM Optimization Hub that got released last year in 2022. And you will see all the links to the previous sessions that have been delivered since 2021, actually. Maybe should now add the year. And you will see it covers many topics, such as how Oracle works, managing unrecognized applications, managing hybrid applications in SAS Manager and ITAM. So you will see many 17 topics where you can access every time the recording and the documentation and the PowerPoint used. So if I go and show a little bit, this is the coming SAM Operations Hub. Okay, it's not bigger like that, but the SAM Operations Hub will be all about catching the KPIs, the number of failed tasks in the last run, the number of beacons that don't report correctly, the number of orphan virtual machines, the number of merged devices. That is a quite technical topic, but that can have a big cause of false positive. Number of unlicensed commercial installations. So you will see, you will have some high-level view on what is going well and not well, and each color will link to a deep dive, which will be a report that shows, for instance, here, quite easy. It will open the list of tasks filtered on failed equals yes and show last only, for instance. And you will get, even more interesting, I would say, than for the SAM Optimization Hub, you will get the trends on these KPIs, which will be in percents. So you will get an interesting view on, did you have issues or do you have issues? Are you fixing them? Very important. So not to show the full document, but it contains a lot of details, and every time it will contain some links to eventually some solutions or to the reports. The VM gaps from vCenter, this is a report, VM inventory gaps from vCenter, the report I was describing, for instance, now released, and the community solution is here. And you see that we have some previews, some drill downs either to the documentation, if it's already released, or to the solutions, and you get the full details on what is coming, the SAM Operations Hub is coming, or on what has been released. For instance, going on the bottom, the SAM Optimization Hub is getting released, has been released already in 2022, and this version, which is the evolution, we have taken some random data for the snapshots, but you see here what the trend that is getting delivered this month in February. You will see what the trend will include. So basically, it will show if you see, for instance, for the potential optimization, if you see that your potential optimization on Oracle is decreasing, that's a good sign that you're actually making and taking actions to move the virtual machines to the optimal clusters. Okay, so I won't spend an hour, but have a look to this hub. It contains data. It keeps being updated with the new links to the new sessions, recording of sessions, and so on. So have a look. It could be useful for you. And if you're on-prem, it's interesting because it contains a lot of links to existing solutions which are getting productized. Let's move on. And let's move to the core topic, allocations and exemptions for an optimal license position. So I will start with business context, talk about license priorities, allocation and exemption design, some use cases, tips and tricks, and the coming features, which will be planned for Q2, let's say Q2 or Q3 this year, which is the intelligent license allocation and exemption. So just to give a business context, SAM is complicated. That's why we have a job, and we will keep having a job for a long time, knowing that SAM extends to managing compliance on cloud instances. So the fact that we are cloudifying the world is not changing the fact that you will need to understand your license consumption. And this is complex. This is complex for many reasons. The first reason is you may have some overlapping licenses, which means that there are multiple ways of licensing applications on devices or on servers. For instance, for Oracle database, you may have a mix of NullUser Plus, NUP, or processors. For SQL Server, you may have a mix of server and CAL licenses, where you need to license the servers and the users, or some CORS licenses, which are more expensive but cover unlimited number of users. For DB2, you may have licenses which cover your production servers and some fixed, 100-point consumption, PVO consumption for your test servers. So there are many, many cases where actually you have some licenses in multiple metrics, eventually of multiple versions. You could have, for instance, some legacy Windows Server 2012 licenses, which are still measured in processors, mixed with current Windows Server 2019, which are computed in cores. And all of this is managed by the reconciliation. If you create multiple licenses, the Flexera one item reconciliation will try to cover the best way, and that we'll talk about priorities, the best way, the best installation with the best licenses. But sometimes you cannot guess, and you need to influence what the optimization and what the reconciliation will do. As well, multi-server vendors, there is a bundling capability in ITAM, which allows automatically, depending on your primary and supplementary applications that you define in the license, that will compute the best coverage, what applications are covered by what license, and if an application is supplementary for a license, it comes for free in a way, so the bundling will take advantage of consuming a license to cover a maximum number of supplementary products. However, it can happen that you have a multi-server bundle. Typically, a database for SQL Server is on a server, while the database, SQL database is somewhere for the SCCM, for instance, System Center or SCCM server, which are not on the same server. So here you will need something to reflect the fact that two applications or supplementary application is consumed on a server which is not on the same, which doesn't have the primary application. Third type of topics that make things complex, you may have complex licensing optimization rules. Non-production servers, when accessed only by users with MSDN subscription, are free. Good. But actually, you will see that it's not always all non-production servers. It sometimes depends on the data center where these servers are seated. So this is one more case where you need to fine-tune how the licenses will compute license consumption and eventually take away some of the installations of the target of applications to cover by the licenses. And finally, some optimization could be based on the virtual machine densities on hosts, so typically Windows Server. If you have, let's say, 2 VMs in standard edition in a host, even more with the new per VM licensing, it would be worth using a standard edition, while if you have 52 VMs, I've not seen a lot, but let's say 25 virtual machines on a host, which is a powerful host with many cores, you will actually take advantage of using Windows Server Data Center Edition. Same for Red Hat Linux. You need to license Red Hat Linux by cluster, but you may have some high-density clusters where on average you have, let's say, 5 virtual machines per host, or low-density clusters, which are not specialized to Red Hat, for instance. And in all these cases, if you don't help the reconciliation algorithm, it will probably do things, the best thing possible, but the allocations or the exemptions will actually help in these cases. So that's a little bit the picture. In case things become complex or too complex, you can use what we see here. So it's a little screenshot where we see, the exemption reason. So automatically it can be, managed. This one covered by hybrid use right. Azure hybrid use right is automated actually. But here you see this virtual machine is covered by MSDN. This is actually a non-production VM, and you have a high-density cluster here, which actually makes it worth consuming from the Windows Server Data Center Edition. So when you allocate a device to a license, you make a priority for this license to cover this device for the applications which are in the scope of the license. That's the first way to put the context. So it relates to, I would say, a more complex topic that I will not fully address today, but you will see there is a full logic of license consumption priorities. So best is to open the doc. And in this documentation, which is quite long, and you will, I will let you read it. There is a full logic on the reconciliation engine that is followed. That basically says, to take a simple example, if I have, let's say, an old Acrobat 11 license, and if I have a more recent one, and maybe not the current Acrobat DC, because you cannot cover older versions, but let's say a CS6 license, the algorithm will look for the installations that could be covered by the two licenses, the CS6 and the Acrobat 11. And if we see, let's say, an Acrobat 8 installation, in priority, the algorithm will try to cover the 8 version with the 11 version license to keep the rights of the most recent license, which is eventually still maintained. If we talk about other products than Acrobat, for instance. The algorithm will have a priority by version. And you can see that actually if you open the detail of a license, just to show you this type of priorities, you will see that for each, so we connect to a test instance. Let's take the sandbox. You will see that on the license, if I open the licenses, if you take this one, for instance, you will see that there is a sort of priority. If I open in the application list, for each application, okay, so it's a Windows server, you will see that actually in the license tab, you see some sequence which help and that you can even influence, which are a first level of what license covers what application in what priority, knowing that it's automatically calculated based on it's a mix of editions and versions. And that's the first way, the calculation and the priorities is calculated. If we go back to this documentation, you will see that there are many other things that come into play, but what we see on top of the list is allocation. Basically, let's say you have an installation of SQL Server on a server. You have 5 licenses that cover it, that could cover it. An old SQL Server 2005, let's say it's an old installation. You have an old license of SQL Server 2005. You have another license of SQL 2014 and the currently maintained license, 3 licenses, and one is per core and another is per server and CAN. If you allocate the server to one of the license, no choice, the reconciliation will start with this one and will consume from the allocated license. And then you have other things which are, multi-product licenses. So if you have a bundle, we will try to compute and cover a max number of supplementary applications. And you see we have this sort of sequence of priorities which are set. It can be quite complex. And even sometimes there can be unexpected behaviors because it can be very, very complex. But in the end, what I wanted to show is that allocation is on top. And I would even say an exemption is on top of the top because an exemption is an allocation that doesn't consume. So it turns into a free use of an application. So it will even be before the allocation in terms of priorities. So I'm now developing a little bit what an allocation and what an exemption is. An allocation forces the link between a device and a consume license. Fine. An allocation could be simple. You just set allocated. So maybe I could open, if I go here, I go to the consumption, my license, and you see if you want to allocate, it can be either allocated, which means that the consumption will be triggered. So the device will consume in priority from the license. And if there is an installation on the device, which is in the list of applications covered by the license, then it will consume. Otherwise, you could have an allocation that consumes 0 because, you don't have any installation. Next type that I've not used so much as a consultant, but awaiting inventory is a way of reserving a license, which is a way to say, I've not yet SQL Server on this virtual machine, but I know that for this project, I will have it added. So I'm going to allocate this VM to the license. It's not yet, we don't know yet why it's allocated, but I would say, will be deployed by Feb 2023. Okay, so just to show you this, this is a new thing that came in 2022 2.1. So this week, basically, it's an allocation reason. So it's a way that you have to explain and you can allocate with, let's say, awaiting inventory. So you can document why you allocated a device to a license. And to be honest, I'm not 100% sure, but the documentation will tell it. I think it consumes, if you, because the goal is to say, I'm not yet installed, but I will get this application consuming, so it will consume, I guess, for the license. And the last and the third type of allocation is permanent, which means that you will consume for the license whatever you have in terms of installation. So it's a way of forcing a consumption of a server. Typically, we can't inventory this server. I don't know if it's in a DMZ and demilitarized zone, and you cannot run an inventory on it, but you know that SQL is on it. You will allocate it in a permanent way, and it will compute just like the installation was here. And if you had, let's say, no cores for the device, you could even, force yourself a consumption. This is what we call the overridden consumption. And actually, the overridden consumption is one more field of the allocation. So the allocation is actually very rich because it links a device or a user to a license with a type that will influence how consumption will work, and eventually with the forced consumption, which is called the quantity allocated. And with this, I would say you can fine-tune if needed. I would say in 90% of the case, let the reconciliation work and do its job. It will compute in an optimized way. But in sometimes, it's good to have this type of subtle fine-tuning, I would say. So that's about the allocation. I will go back to the presentation. This is what we see here. And you can force the consumption, as I was showing. And I would say you should be consistent with how the license counts. Typically, a Windows Server license will show a consumption on the host. So to be tested, but I would not force a consumption of 5 on a virtual machine, which is on the host. I would force the consumption of 5 on the host that eventually will have a calculated consumption of a number of cores, let's say 16 cores, and that will eventually be overridden by the number you set. So that's why I said, set it at the level where the consumption sits. This new allocation reason, you see, it's quite basic, but it's quite practical, I would say. It's not available for all license types. So the allocation, typically, in a custom metrics, we don't have devices linked to licenses. We have a global consumption number. So you may not have an allocation. So it's very well documented. And finally, an exemption is an allocation that consumes 0. So in the end, technically, this is exactly the same process. When you exempt a server, let's say finally, I don't want to allocate, but I want to exempt either using a custom reason. So we have a normalization on the exemption, while on the allocation, there could be millions of reasons why we allocate. So we did not try to normalize in the new feature, it's just a text field. But here, you could allocate, or you could exempt with giving a reason. And when you save, next consumption will actually, on the host, show, so the host will not be impacted by the virtual machine presence. That's the important. Okay, so that's what I wanted to show, the exemption consume 0. And for people who are on-premise and who like to check a little bit what's happening on the database, actually, if you do an assignment here, you will see that, so we don't mess up the demo system, but if you create an assignment, which is not the best, process, I find it's a little bit complicated process where we can, from this group assignment tab, where we see, the current calculations of purchases and consumption, you can even here, influence and pass a number of entitlements to a specific area. So here it's quite narrow, it's Paris, France. But if you do that and save, it will actually also create a record in this software license allocation table. So the table manages both allocations of users, devices, exemptions. An allocation, an exemption is an allocation with an exemption reason. And finally, group assignments are also stored because in the end, if you say I'm putting 4 for France, it will show, you know, the location Paris, France has a quantity of 4 allocated for the license. So just if people wonder, you know, how can they can do it, or maybe eventually do business importers to influence the assignments. This is also happening in this total license allocation table. Okay, hopefully I don't go too deep into details, and I keep moving. I keep moving on how you can set up the allocation and the exemptions. There are multiple ways. I've already shown from the screen. So just going back on the screen. I'm back on the consumption tab of a license. You see that I can, so multiple ways, you know, either I'm allocating a device which is not even consuming today. I will search for the device, taking, you know, whatever random. I will not save. I don't want to mess it up. And this device will suddenly, you know, be allocated. I'm not sure which one I picked at this one actually. So you see here, it's allocated. You could say, oh, finally, you know, I wanted to do a permanent allocation. And if I save, next recalculation should show the computer, so should show a 20 core consumption for this computer. So that's one way of allocating. You pick up from the list of devices. You filter eventually. You can add some columns. You know, we have many, many columns. Posted in, blah, blah, blah. So you can filter, you can find, you know, I want something which has a host. And I will pick up this one, which is probably not at all adapted because it's called DB2 something. You pick up and you add, and eventually you fine tune with adding a reason, actually, with eventually overriding the consumption and eventually fine tuning what type of allocation you did with this, you know, permanent and so on. And here, be careful, you know, I have two of them selected, so I would just do that on one, for instance, if I want to do it. So that's one way. If we go to the other side, so if I open this machine, that's one thing I never use as a consultant, but why not? From the detail of a device, okay, so we should pay our licenses. From the detail of a device, you have this license tab, which will show some existing allocations, and you could eventually deallocate or even, you know, add a license. So, you can, you know, basically allocate or reallocate existing licenses that would be eventually allocated or exempted from the detail of the device. That's another way. And the third way to do things, which have been introduced not so long time ago, which is extremely interesting, it's, you know, this screen which is called License, Apply, Allocations and Exemptions. And Apply, Allocations and Exemptions, you have here a super powerful filter. So let's say, you know, I'm interested in SQL Server. We stick to SQL Server today. Here, you know, it says, okay, you type SQL Server. I found 2 products, 16 licenses, or 19 applications. And here it's quite powerful because it's a sort of a 3-dimensional scoping. You could say, show me any application. So you may not see eventually, rows which are, for instance, if I'm picking up these licenses, and each of the license is scoped on a small area, eventually some installation that I could have found will not be in this selection. So what I mean is that depending on what is your approach, here, you know, I will take the simplest approach, show me anywhere SQL Server is installed. There we go. I close that. And this bottom list will show me the mix of installations, consumptions, and eventually allocation that I have. So here, you know, I can, for instance, I will close this. Okay, wake up. Okay. So here you will see if you have three types. Either this is an installation of SQL Server. Eventually, this is an installation which is allocated, and you see which license is consumed. So it's a license consumption view. You have many columns here. A new column coming in December being the cluster, because when you want to do a cluster level allocation, it was a pain to go one by one on the host. So soon you will be able to pick up the cluster, filter on the cluster, and say, I want to allocate all the VMs in this cluster, which is a Red Hat high density cluster, to the Red Hat Enterprise Data Center Node Edition, Red Hat Enterprise Data Center Node Edition, and you will be, once you have done your selection, this view, you can eventually remove exemptions, deallocate, or allocate or exempt. So here, I will allocate. I'm doing some random things, but you see that with all these filters, you can pick up a scope which is interesting for a mass allocation. And once you do that, you have this new field, which is the allocation reason. And you can allocate either to the currently consumed license or look for a license. Let's say SQL Server, whatever. And if you do that, it will go through all of the records, knowing that you can select up to 1,000 records, and it will allocate. And if the record was already allocated, it will keep the allocation. But if you do, a permanent allocation and it was a simple allocation, it will modify the allocation. So it's quite clever. It's reapplying to the full scope of what you selected in terms of installed devices, because what we allocate is a device and not an installation. But we started from the installations, actually, application, you see. And all the devices will be correctly allocated eventually with an allocation result. I'm going to cancel. Okay, so I think I've covered this part. From the apply allocation and exemptions, hopefully you saw the interest of the filter, which is quite powerful. And the last one is, the Business Adapter Studio. I will quickly show you how to do a Business Adapter Studio for allocations. It is honestly one of the simplest Business Adapter Studio you can build. So it can work, of course, from the beacon if you're a cloud customer or from on-premise. Here I have the full version of my demo system. So what you do, you create a new one. Easy. You will use a default selection. You will call it, allocations, user allocations, let's say. And then, typically, the source data will be an Excel file or a CSV. And what you do is, so there are three nodes, very simple. The first one is, I will look for, let's say, users. Second node, I will look for licenses. And third node, I will create an allocation, which is in the license list, software license allocation. So I will not build this integration in front of you, but I will take the one I built preparing this presentation. Actually, it was preparing the January some best practice webinar on the Windows Server. So you see here, it's very simple. The computer node, we will not try to create computers from this Excel import, just to show what the data looks like. The data actually here is the flat Windows Server optimization report. So I took the optimization report, I extracted it, or I could have read it with the SOAP API, for instance. And here, I have the flat list of this device has an optimal license, this is the first consumption, and so on and so on. And what the mapping does, it doesn't try to create a computer, but it uses the computer name as a property for matching. So here, and it uses a device name, of course, of the data I have. I would assume my computer names are unique. Second step, so here, it's a device allocation, and I was showing a user allocation. Second step, I will look for the license. And again, I don't want to create a license from this Excel file, which is my optimal license consumption. I will use, the name of the license for matching. And I will do something which is really interesting, which is a data transformation. Actually, the report has some names for CIS data center, CIS standard. And here you can do the mapping between values you will read in the source data, and you can replace on the fly with the true data of your true database. Here, I have this license created. And in the Excel file, which is nothing else than the output of the report, I have this license name, which is a standard name that we use for CIS, for instance. So you have this transformation step, which is interesting because here you don't create a license. However, on the fly, you transform the name of the license you read into the license you want to find. And what the business adapter will do, it will find the license ID, basically the target license it needs to update. And the third step, so it's really a 10-minute business adapter to build, which can process 50,000 rows in a minute. It's really impressive. The first, third step is to have this total license allocation. Very important. You need to pick up this, not the last, but the previous one of the options, which basically will create the allocations which are in the source and not in your existing licenses, but also delete the allocations that are no longer in your source, but which are in your destination. So if you want basically 100% of your allocations to match the Excel file that you have here, which is showing you links between devices and licenses, you need to basically pick up this option. And then classically for an allocation is defined by its license, which is a key, its computer, which is also a key. So there will be only one allocation for one computer on a license. Here you can force the status, which is actually the allocation type, to be permanent. And the number allocated is taken from the source data, which is the first consumption. And here, we have, we can run. I've seen customers, who are spending hours and hours building allocations manually. Here, you can export to Excel, typically this flat Windows Server optimization report. You export to Excel, and you see here it's reading my 1,100 report Excel file. It has 1,100 records. It is reading all the allocations, finding the target database, finding all the licenses, and boom, it has created 1,000 business. Imagine the time I would have taken to do that manually. So really, I engage you to use the Business Adapter Studio to do allocations and to use the data translation if you have in the source data that you want to transform, typically the license name into the source, from the report into the license name that you will find as a target. Hopefully it makes sense. So some use cases, any named user license will need to have we need to have allocation, and maybe I will put the link later. I'm checking here. I may be taking too much time, as usual. So on the community, you will see that there is an article. I will put the link in the end, which is around Adobe allocation optimal report allocation. So here, I'm looking for an article, and this article, this one, here we go, shows, we're not going into detail, but shows how to create a business adapter which will read in Active Directory. This is a typical query we have to catch, a user group from Active Directory. And it will read, in the server, the users with the name, the email address, and so on, for the users which are belonging to a specific group, which is called Acrobat Pro. So this is in the case where you integrate Adobe with your Active Directory, the Adobe portal, and the user groups in Active Directory can be super useful to do automated allocations. And then, once you have the data, again, like usual, you can create this software license allocation script, knowing that the source is no longer an Excel file, but here it's a query on an Active Directory server. Moving on. So named user licenses typically need an allocation of the user, because the first step, a named user license is a license that will consume for a user with an allocation, which means an active subscription for any application which is in the scope of the license. Typically, Creative Cloud Complete includes Illustrator, Acrobat, and so on and so on. So if Nicholas has a CC, Acrobat CC, Creative Cloud Complete subscription, any installation on devices where Nicholas is the owner or has usage for these applications will actually be covered by this Creative Cloud Complete license. MSDN. MSDN is another case where, of course, you need to allocate the user who has an active subscription, but just wanted the current SKU definition is questionable, I would say. The SKU links all the applications of Microsoft to the MSDN license. So any user who is allocated to an MSDN license will be covered for any of the products linked to the license. But the risk is that if the user is linked to a production system, if he's the main user of a production system, you may have a SQL Server production covered by the MSDN license. So what I recommend for MSDN, of course, the allocation of the user to the license is necessary, but then you can create MSDN covering just Visual Studio plus Pro, Office Pro Plus eventually, and the other licenses, SQL Server, Windows Server, will have an exemption by role. This is the use of the exemption. You can define an exemption by role, and of course, if all your non-prod servers are accessed only by users with subscription, which is quite a big thing, or with the new intelligent license restriction feature that we have, you could create, let's say, a Windows Server, a license, MSDN license, which covers Windows Server, SQL Server, and so on. And that, covers all the servers belonging to a data center where you are sure that people have, MSDN subscriptions. So you could create a report, which is all the servers of this data center, which are non-production. And then this license will actually be scoped to this scope of servers, which we know can be covered by MSDN for free. And the license will take away the installed applications from the other server licenses, provided it has a higher priority, so that you don't consume for these specific servers, which are in the right data centers where all users are covered by MSDN. The cross-server bundle, you could either exempt, for instance, in the case of SQL Server for SCCM or DB2 for ILT, if they are not on the same server. You could exempt the database server from the database license. So SQL Server, the SQL Server license will be linked to the server. The exemption will say this server is for SCCM, so it will not consume from the SQL Server. Or you could allocate the server. In case of bundles, you can actually allocate a server with a supplementary application to a license, and the server will have its applications covered, even if they are supplementary, by the license, and even if there is no primary application. So that's one thing which is a little bit subtle. You can allocate a supplementary application server to a primary, to a license, and the products which can be covered as supplementary for this server will actually be covered even if no primary server happens. This is a cross-server bundling. And finally, the Windows Server optimization. Please have a look to this some best practice webinar. I just showed you, the mass allocation I created. So that's the way it works. Tips and tricks. I will be 5 minutes over. Sorry for that. So first, avoid conflicting allocations or allocations and exemptions. Typically, if you have a server linked to a SQL Server 2016 cores by core, and to the SQL Server server and CAL license, which is another license type, not a metric. And finally, also linked to or allocated to a last license, which is, let's say, SQL Server 2014, a license without software assurance, without maintenance. You will come back to this random coverage across licenses situation where the server, the allocation, the reconciliation will eventually not do the best thing. So make always sure that if you allocate a server to a license, it is not also allocated to another license which covers the same products, basically. And same thing, which is even more complicated, never use exemptions on one side and allocations on the other. So I've seen, customers for the prod, non-prod license situation, for IBM, for instance, for data stage, they were exempting the production servers from the non-production license to say, don't consume. They were allocating the production servers to the production license. But in the end, the exemption always wins because it's an allocation that consumes 0. So you had never a consumption on the production license. So the best situation is to, allocate the production servers to the production license and allocate the non-production servers to the non-production license. And you will even see, in the in these tips and tricks, it's better to use, and that's actually the next one. So I will directly go to that. If you need this 100% device allocation scenarios, which are painful because you need to check every week that no new device has come with the application, we recommend that you use this intelligent license restriction introduced in 2022 or 2. So intelligent license restriction, you create a report which covers all your production servers, another that covers all your non-production servers, and guess what? Because each report is scoped to a population which is disjoint with no overlap, you have no risk that a production server starts consuming from the non-production license. So I would say, use this new intelligent restriction. It's very useful, and I would say it's a better option than allocation and exemption in this complicated case, like processor and NUP, same topic. You have servers that will consume an end user plus for both options and the database instead of allocating everything, which could be done, but it's a pain. Just use this intelligent restriction. Prefer the business adapter approach, of course. And what I showed was the business adapter using, an Excel file as an import, as an input. But keep in mind that you can query, if you're a cloud customer, the REST APIs. Any report today is exposed through the REST API, report built on the web UI. So there is a REST API called the reports execute. So you can take the report as a feed of your database, you can even put this data into a staging table in a local SQL database on the beacon or on your premise. And then you could do whatever, super sophisticated SQL script you want to do. I published a solution that shows how to do an allocation for a cloud customer based on the IP address subnets. So you can do intent SQL on your side, on the staging database. And then you can update back your cloud instance through a business adapter. So keep in mind that the input of these allocations, but it could be also input of setting up the location or the corporate unit of the device, can be Excel, but also REST API code, because now we have exposed the data even for cloud customers where you have no SQL access. Prefer the permanent allocation to the allocation always consume. Maybe I will finish quickly. That's one of the last tips. you see that here you can allocate in a permanent way, which means you will consume. But there is another option that was existing before we had this permanent allocation, which was, allocation, consume, license, entitlements. To be honest, this is the same, but the issue with this one is that if you click here, any allocation will always consume. While if you're here, it's more subtle, you could have some allocations where it will consume if installed, if you pick up the simple allocate, and some other allocations will have a permanent allocation. Typically, if you have no real scan of the machine, if you created it manually, but you want it to consume. So you will have more, fine grain and fine tuning in using the allocation types than in using this setting, which is all or nothing. Hopefully it makes sense. Okay, and document what you do. Of course, now you have the exemption reason, which has been existing forever. You have the allocation reason. So think about the people who in 6 months will see your allocations, and they will be glad that you documented in the allocation reason or in the exemption reason what you do. Coming next, and that's my last slide, coming next, we will have the intelligent allocation and exemption. It should be coming by Q2 or Q3, so let's say by September this year, or even June if we're lucky. So this is the same approach as intelligent license restriction, which means that you can define in a report, either a device report or a user report, you can define a target. And this target will be, of course, assessed at each reconciliation. So it's I would say it's a dynamic target that you created based on the advanced filter that you can put on a report. And this intelligent allocation and exemption, it will be allocation on one side and exemption on the other. It will combine, so it will be able to allocate all the users, for instance, because we also have a plan to expose the Active Directory groups, which would be a good step forward. We store them in the database, but they are not yet exposed in the reporting objects. My only concern is on the quantity of data we will get. But once you will have the link between users and AD groups, you will be able, what I was showing for instance, for Acrobat, which is creating a report that shows, all the, let's say, Acrobat DC users, but from the AD group, or a report that shows all the CBEL users, CBEL read-only users. And if you use the intelligent allocation against this report, you can create an end user license that will consume based on an AD group without the presence of any installation and so on. So you will use a permanent allocation. So it means we are, we are not sticking to the accounts we got or to the installations we got. We will be able to reflect a consumption just based on AD groups, which is very powerful. That's it for today. Thanks for your time. Hope you got interesting information. So all this will be available by next week in the community, and I will post post an article with the recording and the presentation. If you have questions, please ask in this chat. I will manage them the next time. And also, if you want to receive the ITAM newsletter, which is coming once a month, and if you did never receive it, please ask to receive it, and I will add your email to the ITAM Customer Success Manager. So the CSM team is sending a newsletter once a month. You will receive this newsletter. Thank you to everyone, and talk to you soon.